Yeah, you can go. Yeah, please.
Okay. Greetings, everyone, to all members across the globe. We all welcome you to MedInvade second edition by Squad Medical Research, an international virtual health care conference. Today's session, I'll be your moderator, Gauri, and we plan to go about on how to write a paper that editors would want to publish. I would like to welcome our guest speaker for today, Dr. Kieran Walsh. Dr. Kieran Walsh is a clinical director at BMJ. He is the clinical lead of the medical education and clinical decision support products at BMJ, including BMJ Best Practice. He is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, a fellow of the Academy of Medical Educators, and adjunct associate professor at Monash University. In the past, he has worked as a doctor specializing in general internal medicine and geriatric medicine. He has a vast amount of experience in online medical education, clinical decision support, face to face delivery of medical education, and both summative and formative assessment. He has published over 200 papers in the biomedical literature and has written 4 books. The first and only book on cost effectiveness in medical education, a dictionary of quotations in medical education, history of medical education in 100 images, and the Oxford textbook of medical education. We're honored to have you, sir, and it's a privilege to be moderating the session with you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, and it's delighted to be here and to have this opportunity to speak to you all. I'm just going to share my screen now so that you can all see my slides, and then I will start. Great, so you should all be able to see my slides now. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. Kieran Walsh is my name. I'm Clinical Director at BMJ, and I'm going to talk on this subject, how to write a paper that editors will want to publish. So before we dive in and start in earnest, first of all, I think it's important to ask the question why you might want to get published in the first place. And there's lots of different reasons, and here's some of these reasons. I won't read them all out, but they range from saying something important to sharing your work to changing practice. And they're all valid reasons. None of them is necessarily more important than another reason, but it's important to keep them in mind, and particularly keep in mind changing practice or improving practice, because many journals and journal editors are increasingly interested in that. So that's what you might want to achieve. What do editors of medical journals want? Well, they want ideally all these different things. They want work that's important. They want work that's original, that will be relevant to their audience, to their readership, to their journal. They obviously want transparency and independence. That they might want a paper that has potential to improve decision making. And of course, they want clear writing. And also, every now and then, they might want a wow factor, an amazing paper. But I wouldn't worry too much about that, because that doesn't come along all that often. It's relatively rare. So if we kind of drill down a little bit and try and summarize, ideally, to get published, you'll tick all these boxes. You'll have work that's original, and it might not be completely original, but it might be the first in this setting. Work that's important, work that's academically rigorous and that you can stand over, and ideally work that's topical. So at the moment, of course, many journals are still very interested in COVID-19, but it's important to think about what's topical at the moment in this year. And depending on the journal, but many of the biggest journals are international. And so they want work that's relevant internationally, more than just in your unit or in your city or even in your country. They'll want work that might be relevant in lots of different countries. And lastly, once again, depending on the journal, they may well want work that's important to generalists. So many of the main high impact medical journals are that their readership is generalists in primary care, generalists in hospital medicine, internal medical physicians, emergency medicine physicians, etc., etc. So think about how your paper might be relevant to them if you do want to get published in one of these general medical journals. And to get published, it's most important to plan from the start, really. And I often meet people who are doing PhDs or MDs, and they say that they're still doing the research and they leave the writing up to the end. And then when they've a few months to go, they tell me they've got several thousand words still to write and no time or insufficient time to do it. So I always encourage people to start writing from scratch. So if you've done or are doing research, then you might then by its very nature, you'll know what will go in the introduction to your paper. You also will know what the methodology of your paper will look like. So you can start to write things up now and not wait till the very end. Obviously, you can't write up the results or the discussion until you're completed, but you can make a start on the other things because the methodology won't change, or at least it shouldn't change part of the way through your research. So you can get going on these things from the start. And I've got some very basic but important instructions and advice. First of all, when you decide on your journal, read that journal, read it regularly and find out about the type of things that get published in it. Read the instructions for authors, that's really most important, and read them in detail more than once and follow those instructions for authors. Often in the resources that I've worked on, like BMJ Learning, people send us content and sometimes it's just in the wrong format and we have to send it right back to them or sometimes reject it outright. And that's not because their paper or their resource or module is not necessarily very good. It's just that they haven't followed the instructions for authors, and so we cannot publish it even if we wish to. And then choose the format. Often when I'm asked about how to get published, people, ideally they want to do a research study, but that doesn't necessarily need to be your first paper. Your first paper could be a letter to a medical journal. It could be a case report. It could be as simple as a poster. To start off by doing a randomized controlled trial and meta-analysis, it's laudable, but it's enormously ambitious. And I always encourage people to start off small and to grow their experience over time, and to start off ideally with something simple like a letter or a case report or a poster, and to grow their experience. And the principles of good writing and getting published remain the same. So when you write a paper and you send it through a manuscript submission system, it's worth thinking about what the editor will see first and what they'll see second and third, and so on and so forth. So generally, in most medical journals, the first thing that an editor will see is the title, and then the cover letter, and then the abstract, and then finally the full paper itself. And so it's vitally important to keep that in mind when you're when you're writing your paper and then submitting your paper. So you might, and many medical journal editors screen on the basis of title, cover letter, abstract. What does that mean? Well, it means that the editorial team will look at the title, will look at the cover letter, will read the abstract. That will be very fast because those sections are very short. It'll take them a few minutes. And then they'll decide whether the paper is right for their journal. And if they feel it's not, they may not get as far as reading the whole paper at all. So you might have spent hours writing your discussion, but it might never be read if you haven't spent hours thinking about your title and your cover letter and your abstract. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of getting these things right. So let's look in detail about some of these. So we'll start off with the cover letter, and part of the reason why I start off with the cover letter, it's much neglected. In the cover letter, you have an opportunity to say to the editor why your paper is original, why it's important, how you've ensured that it's academically rigorous, and perhaps why it's topical or international or of importance to generalists, or anything else that might make the editor think this is really important to my readership and therefore to my journal. And so it's worth spending some time on it. And sometimes people leave the cover letter section in a manuscript submission system blank, which I think is a wasted opportunity. Sometimes they leave it to the last minute when they're tired after writing their entire paper and don't do it justice. So I would encourage you to spend a little bit of time thinking about the cover letter, thinking about why the journal editor might be interested in your paper, and to put that in your cover letter. Next, of course, we'll move on to the title, and there's lots of different types of titles, and here's some different types, from descriptive through to declarative, journalistic, questioning. No type of or style of title is better than another, but what's most important is, once again, to read the journal, to read the instructions for authors, and follow those things. And so sometimes the instructions for authors will say to use descriptive titles or declarative titles, and then do that. Sometimes it won't be explicit, but you'll be, from reading the journal, you'll see the type of titles that get accepted and follow that. Sometimes journals like titles that are engaging or entertaining, and that's okay if it's that type of journal. But once again, the title is likely to be the first thing that the editor will see, so it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time on it. And then, of course, we'll get to the abstract, which is the third thing that the editor and editorial team will see before that they read your main paper. Usually there's a restricted word count, 300 to 400 words. Once again, follow the suggested structure, and remember the 80-20 principle. Sometimes 20% of our results stem from 80% of our words. So it's really, really worth thinking about the 80-20 principle and spending a large amount of time on the abstract. So to reprise the abstract, it's very important. It's often the only part of study that will be read. Like the rest of your paper, all authors must approve it, and editors may screen papers by reading only the abstracts or only the title. So it's really, really most important. Most journals now require you to submit a structured abstract in the template that they require. So it's really important to follow that. And here's the structured, one particular structured abstract requirement. Sometimes it's introductions, methodology, results, discussion, the so-called IMRAD structure, but sometimes it's a structure like this. And once again, I'm not saying any one structure is better or worse than another, but really most important that that you follow the requirements of the journal. So as we go throughout this talk, I'll be mentioning a number of resources that are available to researchers who are starting off in their research careers. Here's one of them, BMJ Research to Publication, which takes you through all these different steps, from how to write a paper through to what editors and peer reviewers look for, through to publication ethics. And I won't read them all out. But suffice to say, there's a lot of resources out there on the internet. It's worth spending some time looking for them, because there's lots of potential sources of support, and it's worth reading them and working through them and avoiding common mistakes that people can make. I said I mentioned a number of different resources, not just BMJ resources, and here's two of them. The first one, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors Recommendations for Manuscripts Submitted to Biomedical Journals. It's a free resource. It's got a wealth of really important information on it. So I'd encourage you to look at these resources. I'll come back to the Equator Network in a second. Another important and also free, this is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors again. And then let's dive into the actual paper and writing up your paper. So most papers, or at least original research papers, require you to follow a format, if not exactly like this, then close to this, i.e. introductions, methods, results, and discussion, which of course we're all familiar with. So let's run through each one. So introduction, you only need a few paragraphs usually within the introduction, 3 or 4. Don't go over the word limit for your introduction. Start off by outlining what's known and what's not known on the research question. Keep it relatively brief. Don't add too much. Don't necessarily feel you have to cite all the papers that have some implications for your research. Only cite the really relevant ones. And then in the last paragraph of your introduction, state clearly again what the research question is and why the question matters. And then you'll have done your introduction, and you'll be able to move quickly on to the methods and methodology. Methodology is a bit like a recipe. It's really the most important section for informed readers. It's vital to follow reporting guidelines, and I'll come back to these again and again for randomized controlled trials. It's the consort statement. To describe in the methodology what measures you took to ensure ethical conduct, and to fully describe and give references for laboratory or statistical methods that you used. Often, if it's a randomized controlled trial or research trial, you'll be expected to write up your paper along these lines, i.e. to answer or to state what the PICO question was. So in what patients or population did you do your research? What intervention or exposures did you implement? What's the comparison group? And how was the research done? Was there randomization or stratification or what? And then finally, what are the outcomes or endpoints? Editors will expect the study design to be the best for answering the research question. And this flowchart may help you to decide what study design is most relevant for you. And I'm commonly asked questions like, well, what's the best research design? Is it randomized controlled trial? And the short answer is that there's no single best research design. It depends on the particular research question. So you can see examples here. The descriptive studies are best for finding out what's happening. Analytic observational studies sometimes answer why or how it's happening. Obviously, randomized controlled trials are really good for working out and finding evidence as to whether a treatment or a drug works or doesn't work or works better than comparative drugs. But it's important to state why you used your particular research design in the methodology and why it was the best methodology to answer your question. I said I'd mention lots of free resources that can be really helpful when writing up your paper. I think one of the most helpful ones is the Equator Network, which is designed to enhance the quality and transparency of health research and to help people write up their research according to guidelines that are on the Equator Network. And they include various different things like, as we said, concert criteria for randomized controlled trials, PRISMA for systematic reviews, SQUARE guidelines for quality improvement reports. I won't go through them all, but I think it's really important to follow these guidelines and then to state at the end of your methodology that you've written up the report, the research, according to concert criteria, or you've written up your quality improvement report according to SQUARE guidelines. If nothing else, the editor will be reassured that you know what these are and that you know what you're talking about to some extent. So they're all available on the Equator Network. Sometimes they're translated into different guidelines. Sometimes they include a flowchart or a checklist, and so you can tick off on the checklist and submit it alongside your paper. And the editor will be assured to some degree by the fact that you followed a reporting guideline, and they'll be used to reading papers that follow reporting guidelines, so they'll be able to read your paper more quickly and easily. Here's another free resource on statistical analysis and methods in the published literature, which I encourage you to look at. Of course, in the methodology, you need to state that the paper has been carried out according to high ethical standard, which include mentioning things such as consent, such as burden for participants, such as risks and benefits to the participants, and how confidentiality or anonymity may have been maintained, and also to mention if it is research that you've had ethical approval from the relevant research body, and to be able to quote that and sometimes include the registration number that you received from your local research ethics committee, approving it if it is research. Of course, if you're writing a commentary or an editorial, you don't need ethical approval, but if it is research, of course you do. Then we move quickly on to the results, and editors expect results to be reported fully and honestly, and they expect the format to be in a mixture of text and tables and figures, ideally, and including all these things will make your paper easier to read. So it's important to include these if they're relevant and if they add to the story you're trying to tell. So there's no point in putting in figures or tables just to reproduce what's in the text. If they add to what's in the text, then it's definitely worthwhile. Of course, it's vital to give confidence intervals if relevant, and to report essential summary statistics. A common error that's made is people start to interpret the results and discuss the results in the results section. You shouldn't do that. Just stick to the results in the results section and then save discussing the results to the discussion section. And we'll press on to that now. Here is the discussion. And tips on the discussion. Start off by restating the principal findings. Point out the strengths and weaknesses of the study, and also the strengths and weaknesses in relation to other studies, because no piece of research is an island. No piece of research is isolated from the main body of the relevant literature. So you might want to point out the strengths and weaknesses of your research in relation to other things that have been published beforehand. It can be relevant to hypothesize as to possible mechanisms and explanations for your findings, the implications of what your study might be for clinicians and policymakers, etc. But I wouldn't get, frankly, carried away in that section. Most research that's published will hopefully add a small little bit to the evidence base. Only rarely does a single piece of research completely revolutionize and change a field. So I think it's best to be modest in this section, and hopefully you'll be able to say that our research added a small amount to the evidence base. This is advice that's specific to the BMJ. Often BMJ articles require you to add a box on what this paper adds to the relevant literature. So commonly I'm asked what particular types of trials or treatment trials that the BMJ prioritizes, and I'll leave this here. I won't read it all out, but all these points are important, and of course this is specific to the BMJ. A very common question that we get asked and at BMJ is who is an author, and it's important you get this right. So an author should be somebody who has satisfied all of the following criteria, i.e. they've made substantial contributions to the conception or design or acquisition, analysis or interpretation, and drafting the work or revising it critically, and approving the final version, and agreeing to be accountable for all aspects of the paper. And so these are not either or criteria or bullet points. All the authors should satisfy all of them. And if one of your colleagues hasn't, then they shouldn't be an author. They could be acknowledged as a contributor. And if somebody has satisfied all these criteria, then they definitely should be an author and they shouldn't be excluded from authorship. It's generally a good idea to agree who the authors are going to be on a paper from the start. So, as I was saying, all authors must meet these criteria. It's important to establish authorship and the working group from the start as early as possible, and determine exactly what substantial means, and keep a record of what everybody has been doing, so there'll be no disagreements at the end. So in terms of writing and writing style, I'm just going to add a few comments and tips here. Generally, it's best to write in plain English. What do I mean by that? Use simple words, use short sentences, use active voice. Edit the content, read it again, and cut out content that's unnecessary. Try and keep your paper as short as you possibly can be, but at the same time, keeping all the important messages in there. So try and keep it simple, try and keep the writing tight and simple, and avoid cliches or avoid phrases like these, which don't really add a great deal. Instead of saying at this moment in time, say now or currently. I generally, when I see things like there are no prior published studies on this topic, I often wonder about that, because it's rare for there be no prior published studies on the topic. So be careful before you say things like that. Make sure that's absolutely the case. And as Rudyard Kipling would say, try and tell a story. So as a quote directly from Rudyard Kipling, I keep 6 honest serving men that taught me all I knew, the names of what, why, when, and how, and where, and who. And so in your paper, try and answer those questions, because those are the questions that your readers will have about your paper or about your research or your ideas, and try and keep it really, really straightforward and simple, and answer those straightforward questions. Unfortunately, in medical writing and scientific writing more generally, we don't tend to do that. We tend to find the longest possible word and the most difficult phraseology, and to use passive voice, whereas in fact, instead of writing what we've written at the top there, we can just write things much, much more simply in the active voice, using simple words and short sentences. And that's what I encourage you to do. And well, I think this really just reiterates what I've been saying already. So in the interest of time, I'll press ahead. Try and make your writing evidence-based where you can. So don't say that certain diseases are common or rare. State what the incidence or prevalence are. Don't say a diagnostic test is accurate. Describe it in scientific terms. Don't say that a treatment works or is effective or it doesn't work. State what the levels of evidence are. State, if relevant, what the absolute risk reduction might be, what the number needed to treat or number needed to harm might be. And then you've written your paper. What should you do then? Well, you should read it again and review it again, but yourself, ensure your co-authors read it again and again until you get it absolutely right. It's sometimes worthwhile sharing it with expert colleagues or even non-expert colleagues before submitting it, just so you get a number of critical eyes on the paper with suggestions or criticisms or feedback on how you can make it better. And then it'll be time to choose your journal. I won't go over this again because I mentioned this quite a bit at the start. But then it'll be time to submit it. And it's worthwhile, particularly sometimes if you're up against a deadline, to give yourself some time to submit it. So sometimes there might be special issues which are linked to a deadline. Don't leave it till the last minute. Sometimes manuscript submission requirements require you to gather an awful lot of information about yourself, which you will have, but sometimes about your co-authors, which you may not have. So it's important to give yourself time and get everyone's details beforehand. And electronic submission can be slow the first time, but the next time you submit to that journal, the electronic submission system will remember you, remember your details, and it'll be faster the next time. And then you will have submitted your paper. What should you do then? Well, the short answer is you need to wait. Even if your paper is really good and moves through the system really quickly, it will still have to be seen by a member of the editorial team, then by and the editor-in-chief or senior editorial member. Then it will need to go for peer review, probably 2 or more peer reviewers. It will take at least a few weeks in peer review. Then it will need to come back to the editor. So it's the wrong thing to do to submit your paper and then a week later contact the editorial team and say, are you going to publish my paper or not? You just need to be patient and wait. And you will get a decision. And the answer may be yes, but almost always it will be yes, but the editor will ask you for a couple of quick changes to your paper. And if those are required, be as quick as you can resubmitting it. Sometimes it'll be maybe. Once again, I encourage you to be as quick as you can. Often editors give you a deadline. They say you must resubmit within 4 weeks or 6 weeks. Otherwise, you have to start from scratch again. So there's no excuse really not to get on and resubmitting a revised version of your paper. Sometimes the answer will be no, and depending on exactly what the answer is, you might be able to appeal. Some journals allow you to appeal, but sometimes, if not, you just need to press on with another journal. There's different types of peer review. Can be open, single, double blind, where you might know who the peer reviewer is, you might not. The peer reviewer might know who you are or might not, etc., etc. But it's important to remember that the peer reviewer advises, the editor ultimately decides. I encourage people, once they're reasonably experienced, to volunteer to become a peer reviewer. Journals are always interested in people who are peer reviewers, and you'll learn a little bit about the system and the process through being a peer reviewer and learn about it from the other side. Sorry, I think we've covered that already. And this is the BMJ peer review process. And this is from Gary Larson on the peer review process. But this is a few years old now. I'm sure it's much better than it was then. I think I'm getting close to my deadline of 30 to 40 minutes. So I'm just going to skip through the next few slides. The really high-end medical journals, it's very difficult to get published within them. Some of the open access journals, it's a little bit easier, like BMJ Open and other ones. So it's worth thinking about that, as well as other questions you might have about where to submit your research. And sometimes your paper might be rejected. It's important that you read the comments of the editorial team and peer reviewers and see if you can take those, see if you can revise the paper that you've written up in light of them. Sometimes you will be able to do that. You might not always be able to do that, but if you can, it's definitely worthwhile trying before you resubmit to another journal. Sometimes journals will, different journals will use the same peer reviewers, and so it's not a good experience for the peer reviewer if they read exactly the same paper a second time and the authors have not taken into account their advice, particularly when they could have done so, and it's relatively simple and straightforward advice. So sometimes it might be an opportunity to appeal, but perhaps the most important piece of advice that I can give to you or anybody else who's trying to get published is that if rejected, don't give up. Just move on reasonably quickly to another journal. So I'm lucky I've had lots of papers published, which is fantastic, it's great, but I always tell people you don't see my papers that have been rejected. Of course, lots of us have had papers rejected, particularly at early stages of careers when we're kind of starting off. So it's really, really important to press ahead. If you've done a good job in your paper and if you've written it up properly and followed the guidelines that I've mentioned here and that I've mentioned in the resources here, and you've used good, solid methodology, then you will get your paper published. It's just a matter of finding the right journal for it. So I think this is my last slide. If any of you want these slides or any of links to any of these resources that I've mentioned, my email address is here. Please do get in touch. We'd be delighted to hear from you. And I'm going to end there, and I'm going to see if I can stop sharing my screen. And I don't know how we're doing for time, but I'd be delighted to answer any questions that the chair or panel might have on this subject.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for your kind insights. If anyone of who have joined this meeting, if you have any doubts to answer the sir, you can please proceed.
Okay, so hello, sir. So myself, just Rohan. So I have a question. I think that will be common to all delegates also. So first of all, thank you so much for sir for this really very insightful and wonderful session. It was really very needed for us. So the question is, as sir, you have been reviewing so many papers since years. So what are the common mistakes which you think are committed by the investigators because of which the papers are getting rejected usually? So it would be really great of you sir, if you throw some light on same so we can take a note of it and make sure they are not committed by us.
Okay, thank you. Sorry that the sound didn't come across that well on my computer, but I think you're asking about common mistakes that investigators might make in research or in writing up research. And so I would say that the most important part of your paper is probably the methodology. So it's really vital that you get that right, and also that you write it up correctly as well. And so I mentioned the Equator Network and reporting guidelines like concert criteria for randomized controlled trials or SQUAR guidelines for quality improvement projects. I'd return to those things at the very start, really, so that when you're planning to conduct your research or conduct your quality improvement project, think about how you're going to be writing it up, and think about how you're going to be able to say you've satisfied all these criteria in SQUAR or in consort, and to plan your research and your writing from the start. because if you don't do these things from the start, if you leave it at the end, it will be too late to sometimes to go back and try and modify them. So I think it's really worthwhile planning things out and thinking about both the project that you've done and how you're going to write it up from the start.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a beautiful answer.
Yes, sir. We have one question from Madhava. Gauri, can you ask it?
Yes, sir. So the question is, most of the authors who are from third world countries are not native English speakers and often cannot express fully. How do you suggest we should improve on that?
So I think that if you're not a native English speaker, then it's more challenging to be able to write up your research. It's worthwhile spending as much time as you can reading journals, and your English will improve as a result of that. It's worth, I think, exploring in your institution or amongst your group. There's likely to be somebody who has maybe got better English language writing skills than anybody else, and seeing if they can help you, and or at the very least sending them your paper and getting them to read it critically and give you feedback on it. That will help a great deal also. I think those are the main things that I would suggest. Most of the biomedical research literature is in English, and so it's important, I think, if you're planning a research career, that you try and get your English skills as good as you can, but particularly English writing skills, because ultimately your paper will be judged on the writing, and so it's really most important to improve your English writing skills, or to at least improve the English writing skills of your team.
Thank you so much, sir. Is there still any questions from the remaining team members? I think no questions from them. So, like a small question from mine, like, what do you suggest while picking up the journal? I can see the slide in your presentation, but you have gone fast at that slide. Like regarding the impact factor indexing, like what are your suggestions on it? Being an initial researchers, because the students will just write their papers, like everyone will dream of making it into a PubMed, but sometimes it can ended up being rejected. So finally the uh, student may become depressed like that. So what your take on it?
So I think that you've got to be reasonably ambitious, but also realistic for your paper. I think for a first-time researcher, it's really difficult to get your paper published in one of the top high-impact medical journals. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. And I'd give the advice once again to start off with simple things, to start off with a case report. There's a journal, BMJ Case Reports. To start off with a quality improvement report. There's a journal, BMJ Open Quality. To start off with these simple and small things where you'll grow your experience and you'll develop your skills over time. And as you develop your skills and get more experience, to take on bigger projects like randomized controls, like meta-analysis. Like I remember my first paper was 1997 on epilepsy and pregnancy in the Irish Medical Times. Everybody will always remember their first paper, and it wasn't the best paper in the world or the best journal in the world, but it started me off and got me some experience, and I was able to build on that.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Gauri, please proceed for vote of.
Thank you so much, sir. I think it was extremely delightful listening to your session, and it gave us much more clarity that we need to keep in mind while writing that we often overlook. So we really thank you once again, and thank you for all the audience members also for being a part of this session. Hope you
That's a
all have a
pleasure.
great day.
Yeah, that's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Great to take part.
Yes, sir. Please stay some 2 to 3 minutes there.